Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Randy Welsh, the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, coming to you today with another of the NWSA's webinars in wilderness stewardship. I want to thank you for joining us for today's presentation about the Great American Outdoors Act and what it means for stewardship. So I'm joined here today with Dave Cantrell, our Program Manager or Program Committee Chair for NWSA. He'll be helping me field questions from the audience as we get into our question and answer portion of the presentation. And our two presenters today, we have Tyler Ray, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the American Hiking Society. Tyler is our go-to guy on Capitol Hill as we deal with a lot of cross issues in different organizations, the trails and the stewardship organizations. Trying to figure out ways to communicate and gain advocacy for different congressional actions that are being considered in Washington. And Ben Lara from the U.S. Forest Service. Ben is acting as the National Developed Recreation Sites Program Manager for the Forest Service, and he's going to share with us the work that's going on in the Forest Service to be prepared for the implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act and what kind of projects and activities you might see the Forest Service engage in with that act. So I think we're just letting a few more people arrive this afternoon. But so why do we want to talk about the Great American Outdoors Act, and especially what do we want to talk about with its effect on stewardship? So National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance generally maintains a kind of a neutrality when it comes to advocacy on the policy front. But there are times and situations where things are so important for wilderness stewardship that we need to be engaged in providing information to the wilderness stewardship organizations and volunteers around the country. For you guys to then make your decisions about whether you want to and how you want to engage. And I think this is one of those times, one of those situations where we think it's pretty important, pretty critical that we want to have the broader stewardship community involved in supporting this potential piece of legislation, the Great American Outdoors Act. And we're also going to talk about another act that's also in consideration and some potential stimulus bills that might show up here in the near future because of the COVID crisis. In fact, all of this activity that we're currently seeing now is in response to the COVID crisis and finding ways to stimulate the economy, to provide spending that can engage people in jobs, in job creation. And, typically our arena isn't where people are looking. The public land management arena is not the place that people are looking to, but the effects of the COVID crisis are so great right now that it is spilling over and engaging our community, the recreation industry, the stewardship community, the public land management agencies are all finding an opportunity to be a part of this conversation and to have needed funding head our way to take care of deferred maintenance backlogs, to handle the crush of day-to-day visitation that's occurring around the country. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to be engaged and to get into the consideration, get in the potential mix of activities and projects. Congress has had 2 to 3 rounds of stimulus funding already. This particular activity is more focused on a set of, the Great American Outdoors Act is focused on a set of priorities for the conservation community for many years, and the timing worked out just right for these particular pieces of legislation and particular aspects in the Great American Outdoors Act. I don't want to steal Tyler's thunder by giving away what's in it, but I think right now, there's a lot of great things that are in this bill that the conservation community has wanted for many, many years, and so it's a good time to support it. And so let's go ahead and I'll turn the time over to Tyler to talk about the Great American Outdoors Act. And after Tyler does that, we're going to provide Ben some time to talk about how the Forest Service is going to respond to this act, what kind of actions and activities you might see local units engaging in. And then we're going to open it to a period of questions. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Goose Act and what that might mean for stewardship as well. And we'll then kind of consolidate any questions and answers you might have in the audience and have a conversation around those questions. So we should be able to be finished in an hour. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Tyler. And I will note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on the NWSA website probably by the end of the week. All right, so let's go ahead and turn this over to Tyler. All right, you have the power, Tyler.
All right, thank you, Randy. Great, and just to confirm, Randy, you can see the correct screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Randy, and hope everyone is having a happy National Forest Week. As Randy indicated, I'm Tyler Ray. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the American Hiking Society. In case you haven't heard of American Hiking Society, since 1976, we've been the national voice of hikers, representing and empowering the hiking community before Congress and the federal government on kind of all sorts of issues related to hikers and including trail-related issues. Related to the bill I'm talking about today, the Great American Outdoors Act, American Hiking Society has worked to mobilize the hiking and trails community to advocate for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and to address the public lands maintenance backlogs through hundreds of congressional visits during our annual Hike the Hill Advocacy Week, as well as sending thousands of messages to Congress and activating our nearly 400,000 social media followers and the more than 44 million strong hiking community each year. So I wanted to thank Randy for providing American Hiking Society and me the opportunity to talk about the Great American Outdoors Act today. So I'll go over a quick overview of the legislation, as well as kind of the current status, and then end with how different organizations, including wilderness and trail organizations, can get involved, and then happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. So as a little bit of a background, the legislation, the Great American Outdoors Act, was introduced earlier this year as an effort to both address the full and permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as the public lands maintenance backlog. It combines two bills that have been introduced in previous years and have a lot of organizations and groups and individuals have worked on for years and decades, if not more. The first bill that it addresses is the Land and Water Conservation Fund Full Funding Act, which you may have heard of, as well as the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act. I'll go over briefly kind of both of those provisions in the bill, just so you have a sense of what's included and kind of the impact that it could have on trails. First off, the bill would fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million annually. And what the Land and Water Conservation Fund does is, the idea of it was originally passed in the 60s, and it invests a small portion of federal offshore drilling fees towards protecting kind of onshore land, water, and recreation areas. It's funded nearly 1,000 trail projects, both at the federal, state, and local level across the country, as well as thousands more conservation and recreation projects. The LWCF has protected land, including trails, both on the federal lands, including through the Forest Legacy Program, which you may have heard of, as well as at over 41,000 state and local projects in 30,000 communities across the country, We like to say that the Land and Water Conservation Fund has basically benefited every county and every congressional district. So no matter what, kind of someone in Congress has benefited, and your district has benefited from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The other part of the bill is it provides funding to address the deferred maintenance backlog. I think a lot of us have all heard the statistic with the $20 billion maintenance backlog on our public lands. Most of these focus has been around the National Park Service, and it's $11 to $12 billion backlog. But what this legislation does is it seeks to kind of broaden that and address the public lands maintenance backlog across public lands, including the National Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Bureau of Indian Education. And so the bill would create what they're calling a National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Fund that provides $9.5 billion over 5 years to address maintenance priority areas, which will include trails. On the slide, you can kind of see the background, the breakdown of where the funding will go, with $6.65 billion going to the National Park Service, $1.425 billion going to the Forest Service, and then $475 million going each to BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Indian Education. I know other presenters on the call will talk about how the agencies plan to kind of implement this new source of funding, and kind of then potential opportunities for how trail and wilderness organizations can potentially try to utilize this funding for your trails. So who supports this bill? Luckily, this bill is strongly supported kind of by the broader conservation, recreation, and environmental community, as well as businesses, both within the outdoor industry and beyond, local governments and elected officials. There's extremely strong bipartisan support for this legislation, including by the president, as well as leaders in Congress from both parties. I'll talk about it on the next slide, but the bill recently passed the Senate by a 73 to 25 vote, which in kind of this political climate is pretty extraordinary that any piece of legislation gets that much support. And the bill is also supported by the trails community. Over the past years and decades, the trails community has been steadfast supporters of both fully funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as seeking to address the maintenance backlog across our public lands. Obviously, we know that trails and kind of the maintenance needs and the deferred maintenance needs of trails is a big part of that backlog, and is really kind of one of the main access points for how recreation users access our various public lands. So it's extremely important to the trails community that those trails be preserved and maintained. I'll go in a little bit about what the current status of the bill is. As I mentioned, in June, the Senate passed the Great American Outdoors Act with a strong bipartisan vote of 73 to 25. And in breaking news that just broke last night, the House is expected to vote on the bill next week, which is great news. Currently, the bill in the House has 219 co-sponsors, so a majority of the House members support this bill. And it has both strong Democratic and Republican support, kind of furthering that kind of this issue kind of excels beyond kind of partisan issues, and is really kind of bringing people together, which is really great and something that we don't really see often on a lot of pieces of legislation. So the House is expected to vote on this piece of legislation next week, and the community's biggest need right now is to shore up and confirm support so that we have a really strong vote on this bill when it passes, and then hopefully soon will be quickly signed into law soon after. Having a strong vote on this bill will not only show kind of the strong bipartisan nature of kind of this effort, but really help to show that kind of conservation, outdoor recreation, and environmental bills like this really are kind of a non-controversial issue, and help future bills pass by kind of showing the wide support that there is for it. So what can you do to help, and what can trail organizations do to really get this bill over the finish line. The most critical thing to do right now is to really reach out to your representatives in Congress, specifically the House of Representatives, and ask them to confirm their support for the Senate passed Great American Outdoors Act when it's brought to the floor for a vote. Right now, representatives are deciding whether or not they're going to support this bill, and it's crucial for them to hear from the constituents that they represent and kind of the interests that they represent, specifically from kind of the trails and the wilderness community, that they're behind this bill and that it'll benefit them. So I really encourage you, if you have contacts with your local representative, or if you need contacts for your local representatives, to reach out and to reach out to me. As well as another opportunity is to share on social media and kind of with the members of your organizations, encouraging them to take action to contact their representatives to support this bill. Basically, we need a large groundswell of support and voices kind of showing their support of this legislation in order to get it across the finish line. American Hiking Society has created a tool that you can see the link below, and I can share this with Randy to share afterwards if helpful, that allows you to easily send an email to your representative asking them to vote for the bill and to support it. This is a really easy action that takes less than 30 seconds, but is a great way to get a lot of voices and kind of the trails and hiking and kind of wilderness community to show their support and allow kind of individuals on social media to show their support. I encourage you, if you are able to reach out, to do so this week. Any responses that you can get, it would be very helpful to kind of share back with either Randy or myself so that the broader coalition and community that's working on this can really be able to track and identify which members may need additional outreach on the legislation. And then lastly, I just wanted to offer American Hiking Society and myself as a resource. If you would like more information on this, including contacts for your local representative, fact sheets, or sample social media, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's a lot of different organizations and resources that are available to kind of provide you any information and answer any questions that you may have. But this is really exciting news. This bill is predicted to be kind of the biggest outdoor recreation and kind of conservation bill that has passed in the last decade at least, if not in the last 50 years, kind of since the original LWCF passed. Just for kind of the size of it and the especially with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the permanence of it, the fact that we'll get continued funding to be able to further conservation efforts, build new trails, and kind of maintain the existing trails. So I really encourage you if you are able to reach out to your elected officials and really encourage them to support this bill. Thanks, Randy.
All right, thank you, Tyler. Yeah, turning over to Ben here for how the Forest Service would intend to use part of that $1.45 billion in money that would come through this bill. But as you're probably wondering, what's the impact going to be for wilderness stewardship organizations? We don't necessarily have a lot of deferred maintenance of facilities, but there are the main things that I think will potentially can affect is land acquisition for wilderness inholdings, participating in trying to get that work done, and then definitely trails. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of that from Ben in terms of what work is going on with trails. And we'll have some other ideas here to share with you after Ben's presentation. So Ben, take it away. Make sure you're not muted.
Great. Yeah, just as I get off of mute. Thanks for that, Randy. And just to confirm, are you seeing my screen? Randy, can you give me a...
Now I'm muted. Yes, yes, we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. So yeah, again, my name is Ben Lar. I'm the acting National Developed Site program manager out of the Washington office, but as you can see from my background, I'm not actually in the Washington office. I'm in my cloffice. I had to correct Randy because he asked me if I was in a closet. I'm like, no, Randy, I'm in a cloffice. It's office/closet. And for any of you cloffice workers out there, please drop in the chat box that you work in a cloffice as well, and we'll start a Facebook group so that we can kind of start complaining about the travesty of working in a cloffice. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Forest Service is prepping for possible passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. And I want to preface everything I'm saying that this is draft legislation. There is indication that there's a good chance it may pass, and we are prepping for that possibility. But until that act passes and until we have an actual law in place, we won't know exactly what the language will say. But the Forest Service is certainly preparing for the passage of that legislation. But one thing I did want to touch on that's non-Great American Outdoors Act discussion is the fact that we're in the National Forest Week, and the National Forest Foundation is doing some really cool things associated with this important week. You see on the screen there that there's a Q and answer discussion with the program manager for NFF out of California, talking with Nature for All. And as we all know, there's a big kind of discussion going on in our country about equality and access. And certainly the Forest Service is trying to utilize this opportunity to be positioned to provide more access to all of Americans when it comes to visiting your national forest. So you can find out more information about what's going on with National Forest Week from that website below. So getting into some of the numbers, Tyler mentioned some of those bigger numbers, and at first I thought, well, shoot, my numbers are wrong because they're a lot smaller than what Tyler was talking about. And even heard Randy talk a little bit about how there's $1.4 billion that the Forest Service is getting. So we're trying to kind of estimate if the max amount was given to the agencies, what that would look like on an annual basis. And if we were given the max amount on an annual basis, we'd be receiving about $285 million annually. And if you've looked at the legislation, it states that we should put it into two different buckets, essentially. One would be for non-transportation, and if we max or use the percentage breakdown that the legislation talks about, 65% of that 285 annually would be about 185 million. Then we go to the other bucket, and that's transportation. And if we use the maximum, which is essentially 35% of the annual 285 million, we'd be looking at 100 million for that. And that's the upper limit. That's the maximum. It could be, according to how the legislation is written, it could be that there's more emphasis on non-transportation infrastructure or deferred maintenance, which would reduce that transportation. But the maximum on any given year would be 100 million for that transportation. Another key component of trying to interpret or define or understand what the draft legislation is talking about, that's really near and dear to Tyler as well as other wilderness and trails managers, is where we put trails in these two buckets. And we've had a lot of discussion internally, and I know other organizations have had discussions externally, and we'll be able to clearly define it hopefully once and if the bill gets passed. But right now there's some pretty specific language in there that talks about what they're meaning when they say transportation. And I'll read the definition there in the bill, and it says that transportation may be allocated for transportation projects of the covered agencies, including paved and unpaved. Some screens here. Excuse me. Paved and unpaved roads, bridges, tunnels, and paved parking areas. So it's pretty clear that they're talking about roads in the context of the draft legislation. So we internally, at least for this time being, when we we talk about trails, we're putting them into that non-transportation category. So what are we doing? So the legislation talks about a pretty quick time frame for the agencies to respond with a list of priority deferred maintenance projects that we have come up with. And nationally with the Forest Service, we don't have, other than the capital improvement projects, we don't have a national prioritization or ranking for deferred maintenance efforts. There may be some prioritization that takes place at the region that's non-capital improvement projects, but at least at a national level, that's the one program we have. We recognize that program has some, it's not directly conducive to just using for, let's use all the projects, place it into, prioritization for Great American Outdoors and move on from there. We recognize a couple of big kind of stumbling blocks when we look at just the CIP project priority list. One is that it just focuses on large scale projects. It's intended to be any project that's over $500,000 or $500,000. And as a lot of you trail folks on the call know, sometimes deferred maintenance for trails doesn't add up to that large $500K / $500,000 project category. So what do we do with those projects? The other thing that it doesn't address is some of the recreation infrastructure that doesn't add up to 500K. So we recognize that the CIP priority prioritization process is not perfect, but it can serve as a starting point. So that's what we're currently looking at, with ways to incorporate trails specifically and ways to incorporate other lower price tag type of deferred maintenance associated with recreation facilities. The other thing I'll mention on this slide is the legislation points out that, and I'll read when it talks about actual plans. It says any priority deferred maintenance project funded under this section shall be consistent with an applicable transportation deferred maintenance or capital improvement plan developed by the applicable covered agency. So it really points out that each agency should have a national prioritization process in place, and that's what we're trying to establish within the Forest Service. So when I talk about national process, we all recognize that there probably is opportunity to develop a national framework or guidelines associated with how the money should be spent, but we need to be looking at maybe a lower level implementation or allocation of these funds to get at some of the smaller or finer scale prioritization that takes place maybe at a regional level. So that's essentially what we're doing, is we're not only just thinking about how we're prioritizing some of the larger scale deferred maintenance projects, we're also looking at ways that we can set up guidelines and then allocate the funding down to the regional level so that they can understand better what the needs are at a smaller scale. And this would certainly allow for implementation of smaller scale deferred maintenance, which certainly would include trails. One other thing I'll mention at this point is, and Tyler mentioned this, that the Park Service is getting the vast majority of these funds, and we have opened up some communication dialogue with NPS to kind of understand how they're developing their strategy for providing the guidance on what these funds are intended for. And we've also started the dialogue with NPS to look at efficiencies that we can gain from coordinated either design of infrastructure deferred maintenance projects, NEPA or planning associated with deferred maintenance, and maybe even some contracting where we're using some of those same local contractors to implement the funds. But the main point there is we're working with NPS to understand how they're prepping for the possible passage of this legislation. And then finally, I wanted to maybe just touch on some ideas that we've talked about internally, and know that there's a lot of dialogue on how we can engage the stewardship communities, including wilderness-focused organizations, on assisting with and helping with, making sure that we are spending these funds in the fashion that Congress has asked us to. And I just jotted down a few bullet items. This is certainly open for discussion from folks, on this call, and what ideas you feel like your organization or the broader wilderness stewardship organizations can play. Things I thought about was encouraging matching or partner contributions. You guys are creative. I mean, this is your bread and butter of leveraging outside funding sources to improve the way we deliver services to the public. I think there's always a component from stewardship organizations in helping us identify, and this is certainly the case for trails, identifying deferred maintenance backlog issues, and also reporting on the status of those deferred maintenance needs. And then finally, I think another idea would be to assist in project accomplishments associated with, I'm sorry, I just realized that I'm looking at two different screens and I'm not advancing the slides for you guys. I apologize for that. So we're on this last slide associated with how stewardship organizations can help us with this. And this is where I think brainstorming needs to take place. We don't have all the answers. Tyler has a keen interest and keen knowledge about what the act will actually say. So I think I would encourage you guys to continue to work on ways in which you think you can help the Forest Service implement the Great American Outdoors Act. And then, one other thing that kind of is in the forefront of everybody's minds, and it kind of came up when I brought up the opportunity for you to attend that Q&A session with the National Forest Foundation, is I would encourage this group to think creatively on how we can align our stewardship organizations to be more inclusive of all people in our country to access to public lands, to feel comfortable recreating on their public lands, and to understand their role in stewardship. And maybe thinking about that in the context of, we've got potentially the initial investment of more funds to address deferred maintenance. How can we align that with this other national issue that we're dealing with? And I'll pause. I think that is it for me, and we can move on to questions, Randy.
Let's see, before we get to some questions, I've got a couple other slides I just wanted to share with folks. Give this just a second to load up. All right, so while this loads up, there we go. Hopefully you guys can see that out there. So we've talked about the Senate Bill 3422, the Great American Outdoors Act, which has passed the Senate, heading to the House next week. And as Tyler mentioned, we really need your support. Letters, emails, calls, social media, anything that would show and express support for this great act, because it will do some wonderful things for the public lands and for stewardship. And then, as we mentioned, there's the potential for a lot of great work that can be done. Another bill that I wanted to mention, and this has been talked about in numerous venues, is the 21st Century Conservation Corps for Our Health and Our Jobs Act. This is a bill that's being sponsored by Representative Nagoose from Colorado. Initially, when it was first put out, it was pretty much a Conservation Corps focused bill to support the conservation corps around the country. Through the conversations led by ourselves, the Wilderness Society, Tyler's help, the Conservation Corps community, working with the other groups in DC and with the representative, have expanded the focus and have expanded the outreach. It was definitely recognized that if we're going to try to have jobs in the outdoors, that the Conservation Corps is not the only group out there that can do that. That stewardship organizations, trail stewardship organizations, that are engaging volunteers or their own interns, their own staff, also have a role to play, and often are some of the important local participants in the stewardship work. So Representative Neguse has included specific language in the bill that requests the agencies to the extent possible, practicable, use qualified youth and conservation corps, use nonprofit wilderness and trail stewardship organizations, and to further consult with groups like the Core Network, ourselves, American Trails, and other public land stewardship to identify appropriate projects, activities, and workforce development outcomes that will be engaged with this bill. Now, this bill also includes a tremendous amount of money. I don't have the details spelled out for you, but let me just read a couple of things that Neguse's bill would do. Be $9 billion for qualified land and conservation corps, job training, hiring, and then restoration work on public lands and watersheds. $6 billion to the Forest Service to create jobs and reduce maintenance backlog on the National Forest System. $100 million for land management agencies to purchase and provide personal protective equipment for employees, contractors, service workers, and I'm assuming volunteers with our stewardship organizations would be included. Increased access to the public lands by expanding programs like the Every Kid Outdoors and the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership. There's even a relief fund here for outfitters and guides and to help see them stay afloat through the truncated recreation season. So this bill has a bunch of other aspects as well. There's $4 billion for other stewardship activities to improve forest health and reduce risk of catastrophic wildfire, $600 million for Forest Service, state and private forestry programs. So there's a wide array of potential stewardship work that could be accomplished through this bill as well. And as Tyler said, it's sort of in the wings as the starting point for conversations about the next round of job stimulus that is occurring in Congress. And there's components within this bill that could certainly make up or be part of that stimulus. So it's important to keep your eyes on this particular piece of legislation as well, and to potentially support it if that be your inclination. We think it has a lot of great potential, a lot of great opportunity for people to be involved. So how might stewardship organizations engage? And while I talk through this slide, now's the time to start writing your questions into the question dialog box, and then we'll open up the floor for responding to those questions. But really, continue to write letters of support, be involved in the email campaigns, share your support on social media, call, email your local representatives and senators. And then there have been some sign-on letter campaigns for these and other bills. Consider having your organization participate. As we become aware of them, we'll certainly share those opportunities with our audience. But they are important ways to have your organization stand up and be counted among all the other stewardship organizations in important advocacy work that is needing to be done. So the Great American Outdoors Act, with the full funding for LWCF, of course, that's going to support wilderness inholding acquisitions. A fairly large share of that money goes towards the agency's land acquisition program, and wilderness inholdings, where we still have many of these private lands inside a wilderness that need to be acquired with a willing seller, that they can be important acquisitions for improving wilderness conditions in those areas, as well as potential other stewardship opportunities in those lands as to be rehabilitated. So I think you can all support that work. the other stewardship work that could be, of course, trail maintenance, trail improvement, deferred maintenance on trails. Those are going to be certainly easy and easy. They're the ones that come to mind the first. They're the easy answer for how to use a lot of these funds. But there's going to be potential for deferred maintenance on recreation sites and trailheads. And the wilderness stewardship community could definitely be involved in helping to see wilderness trailheads improved with the use of these funds. Depending on which bill, there's going to be a lot of potential for coordination and cooperation with conservation corps. If the conservation corps have a lot of money, there's no reason not to work with them to help support actions and activities that are important to you in doing land restoration work, land rehabilitation work within your wilderness areas, and join in partnership with the local conservation corps to help see that that work gets done. There's more than enough work to do that can engage all of our different groups together. And in some of those relationships, the stewardship group, the wilderness stewardship group may be the primary and the conservation corps could be a secondary contractor or vice versa. So can open up those lines of communication with your local conservation corps and see what possibilities exist. The other things that can certainly be looked at would be inventories for wildlife, water resources protection, invasive species identification and eradication, and even some of the rec inventories that are done, the user solitude monitoring, campsite inventories. Some of these might also be qualifying activities under this funding as it goes forward. So some of these wilderness stewardship performance activities. We're hopeful here at the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance that we'll be able to see the amount of funding in our Wilderness Stewardship Performance Fund and our Trail Stewardship Fund increase as a result of this additional funding to the National Forest. And as the opportunity, we hope to maybe expand that also to the Bureau of Land Management and even the Park Service. We can always hope. So there's lots of possibilities should these acts pass. And so we want you to consider your willingness to support these particular activities, these legislations, and let's see if we can't get a lot of good things done on the national forests. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up with all my presenters come back, and we'll start responding to the questions. And this is your time, everybody, to put forward your questions, and we'll get started here. All right. So I guess, Tyler, the first question that pops up is, where do these funds come from? Where's Congress going to get this money?
Yeah, so thanks, Randy. I think the most critical answer to that question is that these funds don't come from taxpayer funding. They come from offshore energy revenue that kind of has existed and has funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund since its formation. And so, yeah, like if you're getting questions like that or kind of wondering, is this a new appropriation? It's not. It uses existing energy kind of revenue that is not kind of a new added taxpayer expense. And if anyone's interested in more information on that, I can send a helpful document, but just know it's not kind of new taxpayer funding.
And that would apply to the Great American Outdoors Act and how it would be funded. The 21st Century Conservation Corps Act, the funding for it, I think, would be of just Congress would appropriate it, basically create the money as they can do out of whatever the total appropriations that the government is working from, which would be taxpayer funding. I've not heard of it coming out of another special source or not. All right. And Jay Watson, our friend, has talked about how the Forest Service will manage and coordinate these projects. And you mentioned a little bit of that, Ben, out of the regional office, but could you just speak a little bit more about how you see these projects being developed, at what level in the agency, and when would you estimate that the Forest Service is going to be prepared to discuss actual projects and be willing to listen to stewardship groups and their proposals?
Yeah, I think to answer that last question, I think we're always interested in what stewardship groups have to say about how we address our deferred maintenance. So it wouldn't be limited to just now that we have an opportunity with additional funds. In terms of timeframes, I mentioned in one of those slides that there's a 90-day expectation that we report back to Congress what our priority list of deferred maintenance projects are. And so that's the urgency that the agencies are putting in place to kind of form up what that strategy would be. I mentioned that there's national guideline discussion, so that we'll make sure that we're kind of delivering a cohesive approach to how we are implementing the bill, but having some flexibility with allocating funds down to a regional level, so that they can, take into account regional priorities and maybe even take into account some of the smaller scale projects that the national office isn't necessarily aware of, that don't kind of qualify for that capital improvement style or category of project.
All right. So Coulter Pence from the Flathead National Forest has asked the question about how will wilderness stewardship performance work get included in this mix. And I don't know, Ben, if you've had any of those conversations yet. I think from my perspective, I think that certainly there are components of wilderness stewardship performance that would fit within the infrastructure and backlog maintenance sort of categories. But I also think that the just general land stewardship activities like invasive species eradication, inventory monitoring for wildlife and watershed purposes are certainly going to potentially qualify, but some of that's going to be dependent on how the agency views it and how the agency has a willingness to expend money in those ways. What do you think what's been your impression right now of discussions? And again, I would just say that the agency can encourage it and move it that direction if they so desire. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I again would be open to some creative ideas on how we want to interpret some of that language. I will say that although I'm sitting in the National Developed Rec Site Program Manager role and intimately involved in the prepping for the possible enactment of this bill, there's a lot more folks than myself that are working on this, and that includes folks in engineering, that includes folks in trails, that includes folks in the wilderness side of things. And so we are kind of strategically trying to figure out what are the abilities to implement this act or this bill and still fall in line with what Congress is asking us to do. But I think now is a great time to start exploring what are some of the potential options.
So Ben, we have a question from Elaine that talks about how might the Forest Service implement this funding. Is there, in the discussions that you've had now, of course, the Forest Service can just spend the money themselves through contracting or hire employees. But we all know some of the detriments of that direction. Is the agency looking at potentially providing grants or doing other challenge cost share sort of activities, or creating pools of funds that could be used at a regional or local level to start implementing this work?
Yeah, I think the Forest Service would certainly be open to options to, and I mentioned that in one of the last slides, is, the stewardship community has been really good about being efficient with the little amount of funds that they come across, and bringing up ideas on how we could partner with a stewardship organization to leverage the great outdoors funding that the agency would be getting with either in-kind or labor or design. You know, there's probably a whole suite of different capacity building efforts that the stewardship community can bring to implement some of the deferred maintenance projects that the Act is intended for.
Ben, could you talk a little bit about how the agency would look at the land stewardship activities that might be accomplished? You know, restoration of any degraded habitats. We have a question from Anne Marie as to whether that would be included in part of the work that would be accomplished in that deferred maintenance backlog.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I could bring up that we've talked about is, you know, addressing some of the deferred maintenance from an infrastructure standpoint addresses maybe some impacts that we're seeing on the environment because we're not maintaining our infrastructure, or the infrastructure isn't adequate or not in the right location. So ways that we can focus on that infrastructure neglect, or not, I shouldn't say neglect, it's more just not having the resources to maintain our facilities. And then what is the impact from that? People go to a place where there's no facility, or people, you know, damage that facility because it's already damaged. So I think there's certainly opportunity for that. We are working with Ecosystem Services on ways that, you know, some of the language in the bill could be used to address resource concerns. But as you guys know, this bill is focused on deferred maintenance of infrastructure. And Tyler, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Okay. I was hoping that we would have Brenda on to talk about some specific trail issues. But Bill, Hodge out there, would you care to elaborate a little bit on your conversation? Oh, shoot. Let me see if I can find you again, Bill. But yeah, here we go. So Bill, I'm going to go ahead and activate your mic. So Bill, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So you've got a couple of great questions in here, Bill, and this is one that I think Tyler would appreciate, having been involved in the National Forest Trail Stewardship Act. But Bill, would you talk a little bit about that nexus, about the identification of prior needs done through that act and how they might form the basis for a substantial amount of work that could be accomplished with this new funding?
Yeah, when Ben was talking about the effort to try to figure out, it's very interesting, and thanks guys for doing it. It's very interesting to find out that there's meant to be these large bucket projects. And so I'm thinking about, okay, how do we find the buckets that already exist? And one large bucket that already exists is what's been identified through the National Forest Trail Stewardship Act, and the priority areas that were defined in each region. And I think the beauty of that is, again, because this is a maintenance backlog question, there's no NEPA questions here, really. These are trails that are on the system, that have projects that can be done within the trail corridor. And I'm wondering about if we could, you know, maybe Ben, this is for you, is can we make sure that we're connecting those dots and saying, you know, we had this whole process that went on for the Trail Stewardship Act to identify, and it not only identified what became the priority areas, but there were a lot of areas proposed that didn't become ultimately the priority areas, but are also areas of significant need, where there's a lot of trail work that can get done. And I think you're absolutely right to continue to emphasize the partner community can bring lots of leverage. One, we can bring private money to match the federal dollars, and then we can turn that bucket of money into leverage for volunteer labor hours, and we can show the American public, you know, sometimes more than a 3 or 4 to 1 return because of the way we can create that. But I think just thinking about the buckets and as we establish how we can spend that money, thinking about those areas that were already defined through the process that was outlined in the Trail Stewardship Act would be important.
It's a great point. And I will say that, you know, Brenda Yankoviak, who I thought was trying to get on as well, to North to speak, and maybe we can put her mic off if she's on. She's intimately involved or understanding of what are some of the national trail strategy. You mentioned that effort, and there's the 10-year National Trails Stewardship Challenge that also kind of is a national kind of effort that's going on that this Great American Outdoors Act should be tapping into when it comes to national efforts, where we have probably regional iterations of those national efforts on how those efforts, or these trail efforts, relate to some of the needs identified in the legislation. It's a really good point.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying to get Brenda to come on board. But Brenda, if you're listening out there, you need to enter the audio pin that I sent you, and then we should be able to give you access to talk. But in the meantime, so very good points, Bill. We've already got a lot of that groundwork done for trail maintenance and where trail maintenance should be. So thanks for adding to that conversation there. So next question, Tyler, for you, I think, is how about national wildlife conservation areas? Are they specifically mentioned in the bill, and how would they participate? I think fish and wildlife areas are specifically, but I'm not familiar with this terminology.
Yeah, so I would say the bill doesn't go into great detail of like which programs specific to agencies are included. It basically provides funding to the Park Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, as well as the Bureau of Indian Education. And then, as Ben mentioned, kind of gives a little bit of direction of like where the funding should go in terms of priority areas, as well as kind of transportation versus non-transportation. So it would really be up to those agencies to kind of decide where that funding kind of would go in terms of programs. So I think in terms of national conservation areas, really reach out to kind of the contacts that you work with at that specific agency, whether it's Fish and Wildlife Service or BLM, if you're talking about like national conservation lands potentially, and let them know that kind of there's work to be done that could probably potentially fill into kind of what the Great American Outdoors Act is trying to achieve. Because I imagine kind of like Forest Service is doing and looking at where their implementation plans are, other agencies will be doing the same, and definitely the input from the trails and wilderness and conservation communities on recommendations of where that funding should go is definitely should be provided.
Okay, so we were able to get Brenda. So Brenda, I've given you mute access or unmuted you. Would you like to share anything about the? Yeah, would you like to share
and I just heard an unmuted
aspect?
Yeah,
would you like to
thank
share
you so much. And yeah, I've been listening and following the conversation, just not able to engage, but absolutely the point that was brought up about looking at these other priority areas that were established, the Secretary's areas for priority maintenance, those are certainly on the list. As we're looking at which projects to be funding, certainly the capital improvement project list is, as Ben had mentioned, that's one of our kind of foundations that we're looking at, but Trails hasn't always been fully engaged in that. And so we've got a small team put together from some of our regional trail program leaders that are working specifically on helping to develop some sideboards and criteria and things to think about from the Trails program of what kind of projects we could look at. Most every region does have a list of projects that have been identified that are deferred maintenance projects that they would like to accomplish that, again, aren't necessarily worthy of CIP funding because they don't meet that dollar amount. So we do have several different methods of kind of selecting projects that might be a good fit. And certainly partners are just so key to everything we do. And great point about, keeping in mind those priority areas and projects that we've already identified that haven't been able to yet fund. So I think there's a lot of good opportunities out there.
Yeah, and I think to Jay's point, Jay Watson asked another question about talking with the regional offices. I think that certainly is probably going to be one of the key points of contact for how the agency rolls out the funding that would be part of this bill, similar to what past stimulus efforts had been undertaken. So, Ben, would you care to comment about proposing ideas to your regional office counterparts and starting that conversation there as kind of the first point of contact?
Yeah, some discussion that's happened, around prepping for this legislation has been around at what level, what's the most appropriate level to maximize the existing partnerships that we have. And we think, the regional level is a good starting point. There may be more, local or even state type of relationships that we can maximize or leverage additional resources or efforts. But I think that is definitely a conversation we're having. One other kind of thing that I'd be curious to learn from this group, and it doesn't have to be during this meeting, but maybe it's an email or a conversation over the phone about some of you that if you've been around long enough, you were around when we did the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or the ARRA project. And there's certainly some lessons learned that we can maybe not have the same stumbling blocks this time around. So I wasn't around during that time, but I've heard a lot of people bring up, well, let's not do that again. If you guys have ideas or suggestions on learning from that, I think we as an agency would be really open to that, especially coming from an outside perspective. If you were around or involved in some of those stimulus types of projects.
Okay. Hey, and a shout out to Kimberly Schlenker. It's good to see you on the webcam. And so, Kimberly, your question about would funds be moved directly to NWSA or NFF for grants? Well, nothing specifically has been said. We're certainly hopeful that will result in the increase in the partnership grants that will be available through NWSA and through the National Forest Foundation. Certainly with the amount of money that the agency is looking at, I think they're going to look at all the possibilities for spending that amount of money. And I think a small bit should and can appropriately be heading towards partners easily through the cost-effective and pooled approach to providing funding for partners that NWSA and NFF propose. So I'm hopeful that will be one of the solutions that will be looked at. And so a couple more questions and then we'll close this off. A long one here from Kelly. So Kelly, I know there's a lot of concern right now about stewardship organizations and the COVID crisis and how we can survive. But our resources are the people and the volunteers that are essential to provide the stewardship services that are being there. So I think you're going to look at stewardship organizations are going to need to try to match up with what some of the agency needs are given this funding. We're not going to be able to have the luxury of just doing the same old things that we've liked to do in the past. I think there's going to be a little bit of negotiating on how things that are a priority to the stewardship organizations can better match up with what the agency needs are going to be during this time. But if you have that conversation, I think you'll find the agency willing to adapt and to accommodate some of your needs, and then the agency will also get some of their needs met. And I think just working together as partners, real partners, I think you're both going to accomplish a lot of great things on the national forest. And the agency, I know, will appreciate the ability to leverage these funds even more through the outreach that private organizations can bring, and then the support and the expansion of support and the expansion of the populations that would be serviced by these activities will all benefit everybody. So I think that will bring us to a close. So I think that's the end of our questions right now. We've used up our hour. So I just want to thank again Tyler, Ben, Brenda for your contributions to the webinar. Dave, I'm sorry I didn't get you in more into the conversation, but thanks for being here to help out. And thanks everybody for joining us today about the Great American Outdoors Act. Please be sure to go support it one way or the other. We'll have information about supporting it on our website, and this webinar will be available for you guys to share later in the week as well. So any final comments from our panelists?
Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you. Reach out to your member of Congress if you can.
Okay. All right. Thanks everybody. And go out and enjoy some National Forest outdoors right now.
Yeah, happy National Forest Week.